Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights, settling into bed and wandering down one of those historical back alleys that no one really asked about. But somehow everyone secretly wants to know. You know, the sort of subject that feels like it should be in a dusty museum basement or scribbled in a footnote. And yet it's bizarre enough to keep your brain awake at 2 in the morning. We're going to talk about mummies. Not the movie kind, not the Brendan Fraser adventure kind, but the actual dried-out humans who, for some reason, refuse to stay quietly in their tombs. Because history being history, people couldn't just let the dead rest. No, they had to drag them out, sell them, grind them up, eat them, or even use them as interior decoration. Yes, really. Tonight's episode is all about the strange afterlives of mummies and relics. So, fluff the pillow, adjust the blanket, and prepare to drift through centuries of extremely poor decisions made with corpses. It's going to be slow, it's going to be sleepy, and it's going to be just the right amount of absurd. Let's start with ancient Egypt, because of course we have to. When you hear mummy, your brain instantly goes there, right? Thousands of years ago, Egyptian embalmers perfected the art of keeping a body around long past its expiration date. Linen wrappings, resins, salts, the whole package deal. The pharaohs wanted to make sure they looked sharp in the afterlife, or at least sharpish, considering the dental situation. But here's the problem. Once Europeans stumbled across these preserved bodies, they did what Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries always did. They freaked out a little, then immediately commodified them. Imagine standing in front of the mummy of some nobleman who lived in 1500 BC, and your first thought is, wonder how much I could get if I ground this up and sold it in a jar. Because that's exactly what happened. For centuries, mummies weren't just archaeological treasures. They were medicine, supposedly. Apothecaries in Europe believed that ground-up mummy flesh had healing powers. The theory was that since the body had been preserved so long, it contained magical properties. Logical, right? Of course not. But people were desperate. So the bodies of ancient Egyptians were imported by the shipload, literally unwrapped, smashed up and sold as powder. It was called mumia, which sounds fancy until you realize it's just corpse dust. Doctors prescribed it for headaches, stomach aches, bruises, and probably just about anything short of death itself. Irony being, if you took too much, death might come anyway. But hey, at least you could say you died fashionably with authentic pharaonic seasoning in your veins. Now you might think, surely people knew this was ridiculous. Nope. The craze lasted for centuries, well into the Renaissance. Respectable physicians were like, yes, this powder from a 2,000-year-old corpse will definitely fix your gout. Because why bother with boring things like logic when you can eat a king instead? And it wasn't only for medicine. In fact, things got even weirder. During the 19th century, there was a booming market for what were called mummy unwrapping parties. Picture this, a wealthy Victorian household, guests in stiff collars and gowns, gathered around a long table. Instead of tea and biscuits, the entertainment of the evening was an actual Egyptian mummy, shipped from Cairo, laid out in the middle. And then, with great ceremony, someone would start unwrapping the layers of linen. Guests would gasp, maybe sip some sherry and whisper about the mysterious East, while some poor priest from 1000 BC was having his dignity stripped away in front of an audience of London socialites. It was grotesque, sure, but it was also a social event. Unwrapping a mummy was the Victorian equivalent of putting on Netflix. It had a little bit of science, a little bit of spectacle, and a whole lot of cultural theft. At the end, people might even take home little scraps of linen as souvenirs. Because nothing says fun party like pocketing a shred of someone's burial shroud. But Egypt wasn't the only victim of corpse-based enthusiasm. Europe itself had its own relics, the preserved remains of saints, martyrs, and occasionally random people who got mistaken for saints. Medieval Christians loved relics. Bits of bone, vials of blood, an entire body if you could manage it. These were prized possessions of cathedrals and monasteries. Pilgrims would travel miles to gaze at the shriveled hand of Saint whoever, or a finger bone of an apostle. Relics brought prestige, money, and spiritual bragging rights. The competition was fierce. If one church had the skull of a saint, another would try to get the arm. Sometimes multiple churches claimed to have the same relic. It wasn't uncommon to hear about 2 or 3 different cathedrals, all claiming to possess the head of John the Baptist. Unless he had a habit of losing spare heads, someone was definitely lying. But in the medieval world, relics were big business. Nobody wanted to admit their prized toe bone was just a goat's knuckle. And while relics were supposed to inspire devotion, they were also treated a bit like magical objects. People thought touching them could heal diseases or guarantee blessings. And when relics traveled, paraded through streets or sent to foreign rulers, it was like hosting a celebrity guest. Imagine the buzz. Coming to our town this weekend, the actual shin bone of St. Augustine. Don't miss it. Of course, relics also had their own afterlives beyond religious devotion. Wars broke out over them. Monarchs stole them. And sometimes relics just vanished. During the Reformation, for instance, when Protestant reformers were smashing icons and denouncing Catholic traditions, a lot of relics were destroyed. Bones were tossed, shrines dismantled, treasures melted down. Some relics, however, were hidden away, only to resurface centuries later. Tucked in church basements or private collections, it makes you wonder how many supposed family heirlooms in dusty European manors are actually stolen fragments of some medieval saint. Probably more than a few. Let's float back to mummies for a moment, though, because the weirdness didn't stop at medicine and parties. In the 19th century, mummy powder got a new use: paint. Artists discovered that ground-up mummy bodies made a lovely rich brown pigment. Naturally, they called it mummy brown, because who wouldn't want to immortalize their still-life fruit bowl with the essence of a long-dead Egyptian? The paint was popular, but supplies were finite, because you can only grind up so many bodies before the market dries up, quite literally. By the 20th century, art supply companies were running out of raw material. One pigment manufacturer even admitted with regret that they had finally used up their last mummy. Imagine writing that in a company report. Sorry folks, we're officially out of corpses. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, locals had their own practical uses for mummies. In the 19th century, when railways were expanding, mummy bodies were reportedly used as fuel. Yes, locomotive fuel. Some engineers claimed that dried-out bodies burned even better than coal. Whether that story is exaggerated or not, it captures the general vibe. Mummies weren't treated as sacred history. They were treated as convenient resources, like firewood or pharmaceuticals. So let's just pause and recap here. Egyptian kings spent their entire lives preparing elaborate tombs to protect their bodies forever. They built pyramids, carved sarcophagi, hired priests for endless rituals, all to make sure their flesh stayed intact for eternity. And then, thousands of years later, someone in England bought them at auction, tossed them into a fireplace, or turned them into paint. That's history for you. A long, tragic comedy of misplaced priorities. Now, if you're lying in bed right now thinking, well, at least the saints in Europe fared better, don't get too cozy, because relics had their own brand of indignity. Some were chopped into pieces so they could be distributed widely. A saint's body might be split into dozens of fragments, parceled out to churches across the continent. One arm here, a jawbone there, a toenail somewhere else. Collectors went wild. It was like Pokemon cards, but with human remains. Gotta catch 'em all. Even kings and queens got involved. Monarchs would request relics as diplomatic gifts. Nothing says alliance sealed quite like handing over a finger bone of St. Peter. Imagine being the saint in question, watching from the afterlife as your body parts got traded like luxury goods. And then there were the fakes. Oh yes, whenever something is valuable, there will be counterfeits. Plenty of so-called relics were made from animal bones, or even just carved wood. Pilgrims rarely questioned it. They weren't experts in osteology. If someone said this was the jawbone of a saint, who were they to argue? After all, questioning a relic was a bit like questioning faith itself. Better to nod, pray, and drop a coin in the collection box. So what we see drifting through these centuries is a consistent pattern. Humans don't like leaving corpses alone. Whether it was Egyptians trying to preserve them, Victorians throwing them dinner parties, or medieval Christians slicing them up for spiritual clout, the dead were constantly being pulled into the affairs of the living. And maybe, in some twisted way, that's a kind of immortality. Not the dignified afterlife ancient kings hoped for, but something weirder. An endless second career as medicine, entertainment, art supplies, or holy trophies. That's enough for the first stretch of our journey. We've set the stage, mummies ground into powder, saints chopped into souvenirs, and corpses making surprise cameos in art history. In the next part, we'll keep floating forward, looking at how relics and mummies traveled into the modern age, and how some of them are still causing drama today. So stay tucked in, because this story is only just unwrapping, slowly like linen from a very reluctant Egyptian noble. Unwrapping the weirdness. Further, so where were we? Oh yes, somewhere between powdered pharaohs and medieval Saint Toes, which is honestly not a bad summary of human history in general, people doing wildly impractical things with corpses, and then pretending it all made sense. Let's stay in Europe for a little while, because this is where the relic economy really spiraled out of control. Picture medieval cathedrals, towering stone monuments that took generations to build. These weren't just religious centers, they were tourist traps. And if you want to attract pilgrims, you need a gimmick. Some dazzling stained glass, sure. A dramatic sermon, of course, but the real showstopper was a relic, preferably a famous one. If your church had, say, a finger of St. John, you could count on visitors streaming in from all corners of Christendom. Pilgrims would buy badges, leave offerings, and spend money in town. It was a medieval economic engine. Forget having good farmland or skilled crafts. Just claim to have Mary Magdalene's hair, and you were set. Now, this created problems. The supply of authentic saint parts was limited. There are only so many holy corpses to go around, but demand, endless. And you know what happens when demand is high and supply is low. Suddenly, half the churches in France were claiming to have the crown of thorns. Multiple abbeys proudly displayed what they swore were pieces of the true cross. And if you put them all together, you'd have enough lumber to build a respectable fishing boat. But people believed it anyway, or at least they wanted to believe. Faith was powerful, and questioning relics could land you in serious trouble. Better to accept the idea that yes, maybe St. Catherine did have 7 different heads scattered around Europe. Don't think too hard about it. Let's float to one of my favorite examples, the foreskin of Christ. Yes, that was a relic. Supposedly, when Jesus was circumcised as a baby, the holy foreskin was preserved, and by the Middle Ages, more than a dozen churches claimed to have it. Imagine the awkward conversations. Come see the miraculous relic. Wait, don't they already have that in Rome? Oh, ours is definitely the real one. Theirs is just a knockoff. Theologians even debated what happened to the foreskin during the resurrection. Did it ascend to heaven with Christ, or was it left behind on earth? Entire treatises were written on this, which means there were medieval monks spending their lives pondering celestial foreskin logistics. And people say the Middle Ages weren't fun. But let's ease away from Christian relics for a bit and drift back to Egypt, because the 19th century obsession with mummies deserves more time in the spotlight. We already covered mummy unwrapping parties, but here's the thing. They weren't always just parlor entertainment. Sometimes they were presented as science. Amateur archaeologists, which is to say rich men with more enthusiasm than training, would stage public unwrappings at lecture halls. Audiences would pay to watch as an embalmed body was peeled apart in the name of education. One of the most famous unwrappers was Thomas Mummy Pettigrew, a London surgeon in the 1830s and 40s. He made an entire career out of it. People would flock to his events, eager to see the secrets of ancient Egypt revealed. Pettigrew would dramatically slice open bandages, pull out amulets and comment on the embalming techniques. It was half anatomy lesson, half circus act, and of course half desecration. Yes, that's three halves, but this is Victorian science we're talking about. These spectacles were considered respectable entertainment. Ladies in silk gowns, gentlemen in top hats, all leaning forward to watch as a 3,000-year-old priestess was essentially live dissected for their curiosity. And at the end, sometimes the remains were just discarded. Imagine dedicating your whole life to preparing for eternity and then ending up as Victorian stage props. Not exactly the divine afterlife anyone had in mind. And then there's Napoleon. When he invaded Egypt in 1798, he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought scientists, artists, and scholars. They were tasked with cataloguing everything: monuments, flora, fauna, and yes, mummies. This was the birth of Egyptomania in Europe. Suddenly, mummies were the hot new collectible. Wealthy travelers wanted one for their private cabinets of curiosities. Museums scrambled to acquire them, and of course, smugglers saw an opportunity. Egyptian locals sometimes sold fake mummies to gullible tourists. Cats, ibises, or even random bones wrapped in cloth, all passed off as genuine. If you wanted a discount relic, Cairo's markets could provide. Buyers didn't care much. A mummy was a mummy. Authenticity was optional. And let's not forget the deliciously ironic fate of some mummies. In the 19th century, when American paper mills faced shortages of rags for pulp, some imported Egyptian mummies were reportedly ground up to make paper. There's even an urban legend that copies of the New York Times were once printed on mummy paper. That's probably exaggerated, but not entirely out of character. If Victorians could paint with mummies, why not print newspapers with them too? Now, we've wandered through Egyptian corpses and Christian relics, but there's another category of preserved body we should talk about: secular royals. Because monarchs were not immune to the strange afterlives club. Take, for instance, Charles XV of Sweden. He was killed in battle in 1718, shot in the head. His body was preserved and buried, but in the 20th century, curiosity struck again. People weren't sure if he'd been killed by the enemy or assassinated by his own men. So, they exhumed him, multiple times. His poor corpse was pulled out, examined, and poked at to figure out the angle of the bullet. Was it treason? It war? Historians debated endlessly while Charles lay there, probably wishing he could go back to being peacefully dead. Or consider Oliver Cromwell. After his death in 1658, he was buried with honour in Westminster Abbey, but when the monarchy was restored under Charles II, they weren't exactly fans of Cromwell, the man who had executed their king. So 3 years later, Cromwell's body was dug up, posthumously executed, and his head stuck on a spike outside Westminster. The head stayed there for decades, until it fell off and was picked up by a guard. From there it passed through private collections, university cabinets and curious hands, before finally being reburied in 1960. That's 3 centuries of humiliation, for a man who, let's be honest, probably deserved at least half of it. And then there's the case of saints whose bodies refused to decay. These were called incorruptibles. Their preserved corpses were seen as miraculous. Pilgrims would travel great distances to gaze upon these strangely well-preserved remains. But whether it was divine intervention, clever embalming, or just really good environmental conditions, the result was the same. Centuries-old nuns and monks lying in glass coffins, on display like holy wax figures. Some incorruptibles became downright tourist attractions. Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, for instance, died in 1879, but her body remains astonishingly intact. Thousands of visitors file past her every year, which is both awe-inspiring and, let's admit, a little unsettling. Imagine being stuck in a glass box for over a century, while people gawk at your eternal nap. At this point you might be thinking, is there any culture that just lets their dead rest? Not really. Even outside Europe, examples pop up. In South America, the Chinchorro people practiced mummification thousands of years before the Egyptians. Their mummies have been unearthed, studied, and displayed. In China, the body of Lady Dai, a Han Dynasty noblewoman buried in the 2nd century BC, was found in the 1970s in astonishing condition. Scientists marveled at her skin, organs, even her last meal, still preserved. And of course, after being unearthed, she became a permanent museum exhibit, because heaven forbid anyone actually be left alone in their tomb. So here's the thread tying all this together. Humans are obsessed with bodies, not just in life, but in death. We preserve them, parade them, sell them, study them, and sometimes even snack on them. Yes, remember the corpse powder. It's a mix of reverence, curiosity, and sheer opportunism. And through all of it, the actual wishes of the deceased rarely mattered. Pharaohs wanted eternal dignity. Saints probably wanted peace. Cromwell probably wanted to not be decapitated after the fact. But history had other plans. Once you're dead, you're public property. A relic, a curiosity, or in Cromwell's case, a very unlucky decoration. So let's drift gently toward the end of this section. We've wandered through the relic trade, the foreskin fiasco, Napoleon's Egyptomania, and incorruptible saints in glass boxes. In each case, the pattern repeats. Death is never the end. Not when there's money to be made, prestige to be gained, or morbid curiosity to be satisfied. And as you sink deeper into the pillow, maybe that's the real lesson. Forget rest in peace. In history, the dead rarely rest. They get unwrapped, divided, sold, painted, paraded, and debated. Their afterlives are messy, inconvenient, and sometimes downright humiliating. But that's exactly what makes them interesting enough to keep you awake tonight. From museums to modern messes, so we've wandered through the Middle Ages with saintly shin bones, detoured through Victorian dinner parties featuring half-unwrapped pharaohs, and even checked in on Cromwell's unfortunate afterlife career as a decorative head on a stick. You'd think by now humanity would have learned to leave bodies alone, but of course not. If history teaches us anything, it's that we never get tired of meddling with the dead. Let's float now into the 19th and 20th centuries, the golden age of museums. You know, when every European empire decided to collect absolutely everything from around the world, shove it into a glass case, and call it science. the British Museum is the perfect place to start. Because if you've ever wandered its echoing halls, you know the vibe. Ancient statues, giant stone slabs, sarcophagi stacked like someone's overzealous storage unit. And yes, mummies. Lots of them. Rows of coffins, wrapped bodies, sometimes displayed with the wrappings peeled back just enough so you can stare into the leathery face of someone who lived 3,000 years ago. It's quiet, clinical, and a little bit creepy. But here's the thing, those mummies didn't politely volunteer to move to London. They were dug up, packed into crates, and hauled across the Mediterranean during the Age of Empire. Egypt was effectively looted on an industrial scale. Napoleon started the trend, and Britain happily continued it. By the late 1800s, so many mummies had been removed from Egypt that you could practically trip over them in European warehouses. Some were studied, some went to collectors, and some, as we mentioned earlier, were turned into pigment or burned for fuel. It's one of those situations where you can't quite decide if you want to laugh at the absurdity or sigh at the disrespect. Probably both. Now, museums didn't just display the mummies, they dissected them. In the early 1900s, researchers unwrapped bodies in the name of science. Layers of linen were stripped away, organs examined, amulets catalogued. And the results? Fascinating, yes. But the process destroyed the very thing it was supposed to preserve. Once a mummy is unwrapped, that's it. You can't re-roll the bandages and send them back. These days, museums are more cautious. They use X-rays, CT scans, and 3D imaging to peek inside without unwrapping. Which is better, but still raises questions. Do the ancient dead really want to star in endless medical documentaries? Probably not. But they don't get a say. They're research subjects now, whether they like it or not. And then there's the case of Ramses II, one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt. In the 1970s, his mummy was deteriorating badly. So Egypt made a very unusual decision. They issued him a passport. Yes, an actual legal passport, with his name, occupation listed as king deceased, and a photograph of his mummified face. The passport allowed him to be flown to France for restoration work. And in Paris he was welcomed with full military honors. Imagine the scene. A 3,000-year-old corpse getting the red carpet treatment at Charles de Gaulle Airport. History really does love irony, but Egypt wasn't alone in seeing its ancestors displayed abroad. Indigenous communities around the world faced the same problem. Native American remains, for example, were dug up in the 19th and early 20th centuries and sent to museums. Skulls, skeletons, even mummified bodies were treated as scientific specimens rather than as people. Thousands ended up boxed in museum basements, catalogued with neat little labels. By the late 20th century, native groups began demanding repatriation, the return of their ancestors' remains for proper burial. In the U.S., this led to the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. Since then, museums have been slowly, very slowly, returning remains. But it's an ongoing process, tangled in bureaucracy and resistance. The underlying issue remains the same. How do you balance scientific study with basic respect for the dead? The same debate plays out globally. Should mummies be on display at all? Egypt has been especially vocal about this. Some argue that showcasing bodies in glass cases turns human beings into curiosities, stripped of dignity. Others argue that mummies are part of cultural heritage, and displaying them educates millions. Both points are true, but it doesn't erase the uncomfortable reality that these individuals didn't exactly consent to becoming museum celebrities. Now, while we're here, let's wander back to relics. Because yes, they're still causing trouble in the modern age too. Many Catholic churches still hold bones of saints, and they remain objects of devotion. Pilgrimages continue. Glass cases gleam with gilded reliquaries. But every now and then scandals pop up. Relics get stolen, traded on the black market, or discovered to be fakes. One of the most famous recent cases was the theft of St. John Bosco's brain relic from a basilica in Italy in 2017. Thieves snuck in, stole the reliquary, and made off with the saint's preserved brain tissue. Authorities eventually recovered it, but still, imagine explaining that to the police. Yes, officer, someone stole our 19th century saint's brain. Not your average burglary report, and sometimes relics even get caught up in international disputes. Take St. Nicholas, yes, the real figure behind Santa Claus. His bones were originally in Myra, in modern-day Turkey. But in 1087, Italian sailors stole them and brought them to Bari, where they remain to this day. Turkey has since asked for them back, pointing out that grave robbery isn't exactly saintly behavior. Bari has politely refused, so St. Nicholas remains in Italy, fueling an ongoing argument about cultural ownership. Merry Christmas. Let's float briefly to another strange corner. Lenin. Unlike most of the figures we've mentioned so far, Lenin's body wasn't ancient or even religious. But after his death in 1924, the Soviet government embalmed him and put him on display in Moscow's Red Square. Almost a century later, he's still there, lying in his glass coffin under careful preservation. Teams of scientists tend to his body, keeping him in near-perfect condition. He's less of a relic and more of a political symbol, the eternal revolutionary sleeping under the Kremlin walls. But Lenin's tomb raises the same questions. Should the dead be displayed forever? Or is it a kind of perpetual exploitation? Some Russians argue he should finally be buried, like a normal person. Others insist he remains too important to move. And so Lenin stays in limbo, not alive, not gone, but permanently on show. The Soviet Union wasn't alone in this practice. Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, and Kim Il-sung, all embalmed, all displayed. Communist leaders became their own kind of secular relics. Pilgrims still line up to view them, much like medieval pilgrims once lined up to see saintly bones. Different ideology, same impulse. The need to keep powerful figures physically present even in death. And then there are the scandals when things go wrong. In 2011, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo admitted that several mummies had been damaged during the chaos of political protests. Fingers and toes were snapped off, coffins broken. The public was outraged, not just because of the loss of artifacts, but because of the disrespect to the dead. Even after thousands of years, people still feel protective of these ancient individuals, or consider the story of the Iceman, Ötzi, a naturally preserved mummy discovered in the Alps in 1991. His body, over 5,000 years old, was recovered and studied extensively. Scientists learned an incredible amount about prehistoric life from him. But along the way, Ötzi became a bit of a celebrity. He's been reconstructed, displayed, even had his tattoos replicated by modern fans. And of course, people whisper about the curse of Ötzi, pointing out how several individuals connected to his discovery died unexpectedly. Though statistically, the curse is less impressive than it sounds. But everyone loves a spooky story. What ties all of these modern examples together is continuity. Whether it's a pharaoh with a passport, a saint's stolen brain, or Lenin's endless nap, the pattern hasn't changed. The dead never stay put. They become symbols, tools, trophies, entertainment. Their bodies are pulled into debates about science, politics, and faith. And we, the living, never quite agree on how to treat them. As you sink deeper into the pillow, here's the sleepy thought to carry with you. Imagine all those individuals, saints, kings, peasants, pharaohs, who once lived full human lives. They ate meals, had families, worried about their futures. They planned for their deaths in the ways their cultures prescribed. And yet, centuries later, they're ground into medicine, painted onto canvases or displayed in glass boxes under fluorescent lights. It's strangely humbling, because it reminds us that no matter how much we plan, we don't control our afterlife careers. You might aim for eternal peace, and instead end up fueling a Victorian locomotive, or starring in a museum exhibition, or worse, being ground into mummy brown and brushed across a still life of pears and cheese. And with that cheerful bedtime image, we'll close this part. We've drifted from imperial museums to stolen relics, from Soviet embalming labs to alpine ice caves. The theme remains steady. The dead are never really dead. They are recycled, reused, repurposed, again and again. In the next section, we'll keep unraveling this linen roll of history, exploring how human remains continue to haunt modern debates about culture, identity, and the fine line between science and spectacle. Medieval relics, bones, blood, and a whole lot of questionable holy souvenirs. Let's drift now into the Middle Ages. This is the era when Europe became basically one giant antique shop of holy body parts. Everyone wanted a relic. Kings wanted relics to prove their divine right to rule. Churches wanted relics to attract pilgrims. Ordinary people wanted relics because, well, eternal salvation felt a lot more likely if you had a splinter of the true cross tucked under your pillow. And of course, supply rarely matched demand. There's only so much of the true cross to go around after all. But somehow by the 14th century, Europe had enough fragments of the true cross to build an entire medieval cathedral out of solid wood. Because apparently when it came to relics, duplication wasn't fraud, it was divine multiplication. Let's float into some of the more absurd cases. The head of John the Baptist, and his other head. One of the most famous relics in Christendom was the severed head of John the Baptist. And yes, this was a premium item. We're talking front page of the medieval QVC catalogue. Problem was, multiple churches claimed to own the actual head. At one point, at least 4 European churches proudly displayed John's skull, and another claimed to have his jawbone, and another his tongue. It was basically like John the Baptist had been disassembled into spare parts, and each cathedral just picked the piece that looked good on the altar. Pilgrims didn't seem bothered by the duplication. If anything, they probably thought it was reassuring. Why settle for one head when you can have 4? The arm of St. James, with several backup St. James, one of the apostles, was supposed to be buried at Santiago de Compostela in Spain. That's why millions of pilgrims trudged across Europe on the Camino de Santiago to see his relics. But here's the funny part. Bits and pieces of St. James were scattered all over Europe. An arm here, a hand there, a rib somewhere else. In fact, you could theoretically make 3 or 4 complete St. James skeletons out of all the relics that claimed to be him. It's like he had a medieval franchise model, main body in Spain, but with satellite offices in France and Italy, the blood of Christ. That kept multiplying. Now this one is especially strange. By the 12th century, several churches claimed to own vials of Christ's actual blood. Yes, the blood supposedly collected during the crucifixion. Problem is, blood dries. It doesn't stay liquid for 1,000 years. But if you visit Bruges, Belgium today, they still parade a vial of Christ's blood through the streets every year. And guess what? It's liquid. Like it was just drawn from the vein. How well? Let's just say that medieval churches had some very creative ideas about preservation. And if a little red dye had to be added once in a while, who was going to argue with a miracle? Tooth fairies for saints, the bones of saints were big business. But not just the big bones, even tiny fragments were prized. So much so that entire monasteries specialized in extracting teeth from saintly corpses and distributing them across Europe. It's like the world's most morbid dental trade. Monks would claim, "This is St. Catherine's molar." Another monastery would swear, "No, This is definitely hers, and people would pay good money just to touch it. In a way, it was the medieval version of collecting celebrity memorabilia. Instead of Elvis's guitar pick, you got St. Catherine's incisor. The commerce of relics, here's the thing. Behind the piety, relics were a booming business. Pilgrims donated money. Rulers donated land. Cities became rich. Owning a powerful relic was basically like having a world-class tourist attraction. A small town with no resources could suddenly become a major pilgrimage site if they discovered a saint's arm buried in the local field. Miraculously, of course. And then, conveniently, thousands of visitors would pour in every year, buying food, lodging, and leaving offerings. So yes, relics were less about holy power and more about medieval economics. My personal favorite, the holy foreskin. Yes, you heard that right. The most bizarre relic of all time was the supposed foreskin of baby Jesus. Medieval churches claimed to have it. In fact, at one point, there were reportedly over a dozen holy foreskins circulating in Europe. Theologians argued about it. Some said it ascended into heaven along with Christ. Others insisted it stayed behind as proof of the incarnation. And yes, a people worshipped it. Because apparently, no relic was too strange if it promised a shortcut to salvation. By the 19th century, the Vatican got so embarrassed by this whole situation that they tried to quietly bury the subject. But for centuries, Christians literally prayed to what they believed was Christ's leftover baby skin. That's medieval devotion for you. The psychology of it all now. It's easy for us to laugh at this today. But back then, relics had real psychological power. They connected ordinary people to the divine in a very tangible way. If you couldn't read the Bible and you didn't understand Latin Mass, then touching a bone or a vial of blood or a splinter of the cross, it made heaven feel just a little closer. So yes, while the relic market was absolutely full of fraud, exaggeration and duplication, it also gave people comfort. And that's really why it persisted for centuries. Let's drift now from relics of saints and biblical figures to another category that got even stranger, royal bodies. Because if you thought the church was weird about bones, wait until you see what kings and queens did to make sure their corpses lived forever. The awkward afterlives of royal corpses, all right. So we've wandered through mummies, saints, and relics. Now let's dim the candlelight a bit more and float into another odd corner of history, royal bodies. Because apparently being king or queen didn't just make your life complicated. It also made your death very, very weird. Unlike ordinary folks, royals weren't allowed to just die quietly and stay buried. No, their bodies became symbols, and symbols needed preserving, parading, sometimes chopping into convenient pieces, and occasionally, yes, accidentally losing an arm or two along the way. So let's talk about what happened to the bodies of monarchs after death. Spoiler, it wasn't very restful. The problem with royal funerals, first, you have to imagine the scale of the medieval and early modern royal funeral. We're not talking about a quiet service with a few relatives. We're talking about massive public events, processions, banners, masses, endless rituals. The corpse wasn't just a body. It was propaganda. It had to demonstrate stability. It had to reassure people that the monarchy was still sacred and powerful. So embalming became less about hygiene and more about keeping the king's face intact long enough to be displayed in public. Unfortunately, medieval embalming wasn't always effective. So sometimes the royal corpse would, let's say, misbehave mid-ceremony. William the Conqueror, an exploding disaster. Let's start with a classic. William the Conqueror, the big bad Norman who conquered England in 1066. When he died in 1087, things did not go smoothly. His body was too big for the stone coffin they'd prepared, so the monks tried to force him in. You can probably guess where this is going. Yes, the corpse burst. Exploded, in fact, during the funeral, right in the middle of the service. The smell was reportedly so bad that mourners fled the church. So much for royal dignity. It's one of those rare moments in history where the mighty conqueror who reshaped England was reduced to being, well, a smelly cautionary tale about coffin measurements. Richard the Lionheart, a body in 3 places. Then we have Richard the Lionheart, the crusading king who spent more time abroad than in England. When he died in 1199, his body became a sort of medieval puzzle. His heart was removed and buried in Rouen in Normandy. His entrails were buried at the site of his death in Châlus, France. And the rest of his body went to Fontevraud Abbey. So Richard ended up scattered across 3 separate sites, like a royal jigsaw puzzle. Why? Well, partly for symbolic reasons, spreading his presence across the lands he ruled, and partly for practical reasons. Carrying a full rotting corpse long distances was unpleasant. So the solution was simple: chop and drop along the way. Louis XIV, too much perfume moving into early modern France. Louis XIV, the Sun King. He reigned for 72 years, the longest in European history. But when he died in 1715, embalming wasn't much improved from William's day. They embalmed him, placed him in a lavish coffin, and filled the tomb with so much incense and perfume that the air inside the Basilica of Saint-Denis was basically unbreathable. The irony: the man who'd lived surrounded by luxury and endless fountains of Versailles ended up stinking so badly in death that they had to fumigate him with enough scent to kill a horse, and, because revolutionaries in 1793 dug him up, his body ended up desecrated anyway. So all that effort was for nothing. The royal travel problem. Here's something people don't think about. Moving a royal corpse was complicated. If a king died far from the capital, you couldn't just sling the body over a horse and trot home. So medieval embalmers came up with what was called mos teutonicus, the German method. Basically, they boiled the body, stripped the flesh, and sent the bones home separately. This made transportation easier. Yes, it's gruesome, but it was considered perfectly respectable, and in a way it solved the awkwardness of decomposing kings halfway across Europe. Charles I of England. A hidden grave. Let's move to England again. King Charles V, the one who lost his head in 1649 after the English Civil War. His body wasn't given a grand funeral. Instead, he was hastily buried at Windsor Castle in a vault next to Henry VIII. No pomp, no ceremony. Centuries later, when the vault was opened in 1813, people were shocked to see Charles's head still attached and looking surprisingly good. Even after 160 years, his beard and features were intact. Apparently, losing your crown but keeping your facial hair was the ultimate royal comeback. The wandering corpse of Napoleon, and then, of course, Napoleon. He died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, but his body didn't stay there. In 1840, his remains were dug up and transported back to Paris in a massive state ceremony. Tens of thousands turned out to watch. It was a PR stunt by the French government, turning a defeated emperor into a national hero again. And according to witnesses, his body was still remarkably well preserved, almost lifelike. Cue endless rumors that maybe he hadn't decayed at all because, of course, Napoleon had to remain dramatic, even in death. The tragic case of Tsar Nicholas II, we can't skip the Romanovs. When Nicholas II and his family were executed in 1918, their bodies were dumped in a forest, half burned and hidden. For decades, the Soviet government denied everything. The royal remains became a ghost story, a rumor, a haunting absence. It wasn't until the 1990s that the bones were finally identified through DNA testing. Even then, some of the family's remains were still missing for years. So the afterlife of Russia's last Tsar was less about glory and more about mystery, politics, and family members being buried in stages. So, why all this trouble? Why did royal bodies get such strange treatment? Because monarchs weren't seen as ordinary humans. They were semi-divine, symbolic, eternal. Their bodies had to carry that aura even after death. But the reality of decomposition always ruined the illusion. And so history gave us this endless series of awkward, smelly, scattered or forgotten royal corpses. In life, they ruled nations. In death, they became cautionary tales for future undertakers. Let's slowly drift onward, away from royal coffins and into another category of afterlives. Not for kings or saints this time, but for ordinary people whose bodies got turned into relics, curiosities, or even medical ingredients. Because if you thought the royals had it bad, wait until you hear what happened to everyone else. Ordinary bodies, medicine, magic, and museums of the macabre so far, we've floated through mummies, saints, and royals. But now let's dim things down a little further and wander into the world of, well, ordinary people. Because here's the thing. Not every strange afterlife belonged to a king, a saint, or a famous general. Plenty of ordinary corpses, nameless, faceless, unlucky, also had their second act in history. And sometimes their afterlives were even stranger. When you're not royal, your body isn't a symbol. It's not meant to be preserved forever in a grand tomb. Instead, it might be recycled, reused, chopped up, bottled, or sold. Because in the Middle Ages and beyond, human remains weren't just buried. They were useful, yes, useful, because why waste a perfectly good corpse when you can turn it into medicine, magic, or even museum decoration? Let's drift into some examples. Mummy medicine. Eating the dead for your health for centuries, Europeans believed that powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up mummy, was a powerful medicine. It was supposed to cure all sorts of ailments, headaches, stomach aches, epilepsy, even broken bones. So mummies from Egypt were dug up, shipped to Europe, and sold in apothecaries. Rich people bought little jars of mumia and sprinkled it into their wine or rubbed it into wounds. Did it work? Of course not. But that didn't stop people from consuming it by the pound. And when demand outstripped supply because you can only dig, up so many ancient Egyptians before the ghee. Pyramids start looking a little empty. Merchants simply faked it. They ground up random corpses from local graveyards, labeled the powder mummy, and sold it anyway. Apparently, nobody could tell the difference. 1,000-year-old pharaoh or last week's plague victim, it was all just brown dust in a jar. So congratulations, medieval Europe. You spent centuries being a very fancy species of cannibal. The king's drops. Royal cannibalism in action. It wasn't just peasants and quacks buying corpse medicine. Even kings got in on the act. Charles II of England, sometimes nicknamed the Merry Monarch, used to drink something called the King's Drops. It was a tonic made from human skull, ground into powder and mixed into alcohol. He believed it gave him energy. What it probably gave him was really expensive placebo effects and bad breath. So yes, even royalty wasn't above slurping down a little powdered human now and then, which is kind of ironic, considering that earlier kings worried about their corpses being desecrated. By the 17th century, they were voluntarily drinking someone else's corpse for breakfast. Skull cups and bone trinkets beyond medicine, human bones had plenty of other uses. Warriors and nobles in some cultures turned skulls into drinking cups. A nice little reminder of mortality with every sip of wine. Medieval monks sometimes kept skulls on their desks as memento mori, a way to remind themselves that death was always near. And then there were the charms. Tiny fragments of bone, teeth, or even nails, carried as amulets. Supposedly they warded off evil, brought luck, or cured disease. It was basically the medieval version of a rabbit's foot, only with actual human parts. So yes, ordinary bodies didn't always get a quiet rest in the graveyard. Sometimes they ended up dangling around someone's neck as jewelry. The bone churches. If you really want to see how far this went, look at Europe's ossuaries. These were chapels decorated entirely with human bones, not just stacked in the crypt, but artistically arranged on the walls and ceilings. The Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, for example, has chandeliers made of human bones. Yes, chandeliers. Imagine dining under a ceiling of skulls and femurs. Very cozy. Why? Because churches ran out of burial space. Instead of wasting all those bones, they turned them into interior design. It was recycling before recycling was cool. The anatomy craze. Then came the Renaissance and early modern science. Suddenly, corpses became valuable for another reason: dissection. Medical students needed bodies to study anatomy. And since voluntary body donation wasn't exactly common, they turned to less than legal sources. Executed criminals were prime candidates. Their bodies were often handed over to universities for study. But demand was high, and executions didn't provide enough supply. So grave robbing became an industry. Ordinary corpses were stolen from cemeteries, sold to anatomists and dissected in lecture halls. Families sometimes guarded graves for weeks after a funeral, just to keep body snatchers away. So yes, if you died poor, there was a real chance you'd end up as somebody's homework assignment. The cabinets of curiosities, and then there were the collectors. Wealthy Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries loved cabinets of curiosities. These were private collections of exotic objects: shells, fossils, strange animals, and human remains, shrunken heads from South America, tattooed skin, skeletons posed in little dramatic scenes. It was all considered very chic. For the rich, death wasn't just a reminder of mortality. It was entertainment, something to show off to guests after dinner. And ordinary bodies, often taken from faraway lands or marginalized groups, became display pieces. So, what does this tell us? The strange afterlives of ordinary people's bodies reveal something kind of bleak. That in pre-modern Europe, a corpse wasn't sacred unless it was royal or saintly. Otherwise it was material. Something to use, to sell, to decorate with, or to study. It's morbid, yes, but also practical in its own weird way. In a world without modern medicine, refrigeration, or much scientific knowledge, the dead were a resource, and people weren't shy about using that resource. So having wandered through mummies, relics, royals, and the unlucky ordinary, we're still not finished, because the afterlife of bodies doesn't end in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. Even in the modern world, corpses kept getting strange second careers. In the age of empire, colonization, and science, bodies traveled further than ever before. Let's drift onward into Part 7, where we'll look at the colonial age of body collecting, how European explorers, scientists, and museums turned human remains into trophies, specimens, and exhibits. The colonial body trade, trophies, specimens, and souvenirs. So we've seen what happened to mummies, saints, kings, and ordinary medieval folks. But now we float into the era of empires, the age when European ships sailed around the globe, planting flags in places that weren't theirs and collecting bodies. Because, of course, why not add human remains to the list of things shipped home alongside spices, gold, and parrots? In the 18th and 19th centuries, explorers, colonizers, and scientists had an almost obsessive fascination with human remains. Skulls, skeletons, preserved heads all became part of a booming trade. And whether it was framed as science, curiosity, or straight-up plunder, the result was the same. A lot of people didn't get to rest in peace. Let's drift through some of the highlights, or lowlights. Skulls for science. One of the biggest drivers of this corpse collecting was the rise of anthropology. Scientists in Europe wanted to classify humanity. Who belonged where? What skull shape meant, and conveniently, how to prove Europeans were superior. Because, of course, science in the 19th century often came with a big dose of racism. So thousands of skulls were taken from colonial territories. Graves were robbed in Africa, the Americas, Australia, and beyond. Whole cemeteries were dug up to provide specimens for European museums and universities. Skull measurements became an entire academic field. Phrenology. Scientists would run calipers over a skull, declare it intelligent or savage, and then publish their findings with absolute confidence. Spoiler, none of it was accurate. But it justified colonialism and slavery, so governments were happy to fund it. So, the afterlife of many ordinary people, especially indigenous people, was to spend eternity sitting on a shelf in some dusty European cabinet, being measured for science. The case of Sarah Baartman. No discussion of colonial bodies would be complete without Sarah Baartman, also known as the Hottentot Venus. She was a Khoikhoi woman from South Africa who was brought to Europe in the early 1800s. While alive, she was displayed in freak shows, where people ogled her body as a curiosity. When she died in 1815, things didn't stop. Her body was dissected. Her skeleton, brain, and genitals were preserved and displayed in Paris for over a century. Yes, for more than 150 years, she was treated not as a person, but as a museum specimen. It wasn't until 2002, yes, 2002, that her remains were finally returned to South Africa for burial. So Sarah Baartman's afterlife was a long, degrading tour of European science before finally getting a measure of dignity almost 200 years later. Shrunken heads, the trophy trade European. Collectors also became obsessed with shrunken heads from South America, particularly from the Shuar people of Ecuador and Peru. For the Shuar, shrinking a head had spiritual meaning. It was part of complex rituals of warfare and belief. But Europeans didn't care about the meaning. They just wanted the heads. By the late 19th century, demand was so high that local traders started producing shrunken heads specifically for export. Some weren't even human. Animal heads were sometimes dressed up to look authentic. So what had been a sacred ritual turned into a colonial novelty item, sitting in drawing rooms and museums across Europe. Because nothing says sophisticated Victorian gentleman like a decapitated, boiled and shrunken head on your mantle. The Maori heads of New Zealand in New Zealand. Maori communities had a tradition of preserving tattooed heads of chiefs as sacred relics. But once Europeans arrived, those heads became highly sought-after trade items. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hundreds were taken. They ended up in private collections and museums around the world. For the Maori, this was a massive cultural violation. Their ancestors turned into souvenirs. Only in recent decades have many of these heads been returned through repatriation efforts. So again, the afterlife of indigenous bodies wasn't rest, it was display. And then, centuries later, a slow bureaucratic journey back home. The anatomy theaters of empire colonial bodies also fueled medical schools. European doctors studying tropical diseases wanted specimens. Bodies from colonies were dissected, preserved, and exhibited in anatomy theaters. Sometimes they weren't even anonymous. Names, photographs, and life stories were recorded alongside the bodies, as if these people were specimens first and humans second, and if you were unlucky enough to be an executed criminal or a prisoner of war in a colony. There was a good chance your afterlife involved ending up bottled in formaldehyde in some European lab. The museum problem. By the 19th century, European museums were overflowing with human remains. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Smithsonian, all built vast collections of skulls, skeletons, and mummies, and the logic was always the same. We're preserving them for science and education. But let's be honest, a lot of it was also voyeurism. Visitors gawked at mummies. They stared at preserved heads in glass jars. They marveled at skeletons posed like mannequins. It was science mixed with spectacle. And the line between knowledge and entertainment was very, very blurry. The slow return in recent decades, a lot of effort has gone into returning these remains. Indigenous groups around the world have fought for their ancestors to be taken out of museums and reburied. Some institutions have complied. Others have dragged their feet, citing research value. So in a strange way, the afterlives of these bodies are still unfolding. They went from sacred burial sites to colonial trophies to museum exhibits, and now slowly back home again. It's one of history's longest detours between death and rest. Why did this happen? At the core of it, colonial body collecting was about power. Power over the land, power over culture, and yes, power over the dead. Owning someone's remains was the ultimate way of saying, we control not just your life, but your memory, your ancestors, your very body. It was domination dressed up as science, and the people who suffered it weren't kings or saints. They were ordinary men and women who never asked to be turned into specimens. So, we've drifted through the colonial body trade, and the endless wandering of skulls and skeletons across continents. But the story doesn't end there. Because as we move into the 20th century, human remains continued to be displayed, dissected and even commercialized in, only this time, with the added spectacle of modern media and entertainment. Let's glide into part 8, where corpses entered the age of photography, freak shows, sideshows, and eventually, the modern museum debate. Corpses on display, from freak shows to modern museums, so by the time the 20th century dawned, you'd think people would have learned. Maybe we'd stop digging up bodies, stop displaying them, and I don't know. Let the dead stay dead, but no. If anything, modern technology gave human remains an even weirder afterlife. Because why stop at skulls on shelves when you can add cameras, traveling carnivals, and electric lighting to the mix? The freak show corpse in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Carnival sideshows were huge in America and Europe. People flocked to tents to see oddities, conjoined twins, sword swallowers, bearded ladies, and sometimes actual corpses. Yes, real human remains ended up as sideshow attractions. Mummified bodies, dried out skeletons, and preserved specimens toured with carnivals. The logic was simple. If you couldn't get a living oddity, you could always display a dead one. One famous example was the so-called Minnesota Iceman. This was a body, or possibly a very elaborate fake, encased in a block of ice, exhibited at fairs in the 1960s. It was claimed to be a prehistoric man, or maybe a missing link depending on who you asked. People lined up, paid their ticket money, and stared at what might have just been a frozen rubber mannequin. But the fact that the possibility existed, that it might have been human, was enough to keep people fascinated. So yes, corpses became carnival entertainment, sandwiched between cotton candy and the Ferris wheel. The case of Elmer McCurdy. Let's float over to perhaps the strangest afterlife of all. Elmer McCurdy. McCurdy was a small-time outlaw in Oklahoma, who died in 1911 after a botched train robbery. His body was embalmed, but no one came to claim it. So the funeral home decided to make some extra cash. They propped him up, charged people a nickel to see the bandit who wouldn't give up, and naturally people lined up. Over the decades, McCurdy's body toured carnivals, circuses, and wax museums. Sometimes he was displayed as a Wild West outlaw, other times just as a curiosity. By the 1970s, he was so faded and brittle that film crews thought he was just a mannequin. It wasn't until 1976 when his arm accidentally broke off during a TV shoot, that people realized, oh wait, this isn't a prop, it's an actual human. After 65 years of wandering, Elmer finally got a proper burial. So his afterlife was, quite literally, a carnival ride. Photography and post-mortem portraits. The invention of photography gave the dead yet another way to stick around. In the 19th century, post-mortem photography was surprisingly common. Families would pose their deceased relatives as if they were sleeping, sitting, or even standing with the living. And while that might sound creepy to us now, at the time it was seen as a way of preserving memory. After all, photography was expensive, and for many families, a post-mortem picture might be the only photograph they'd ever have of a loved one. By the 20th century, photography expanded beyond family mourning into public spectacle. Corpses of famous people were photographed, printed in newspapers, and even sold as postcards. Yes, postcards. Imagine receiving a cheerful letter in 1905 with a sepia-toned corpse printed on the front. Nothing says "wish you were here" quite like that. The Soviet relics, Lenin's body of course. No tour of modern corpse display would be complete without Vladimir Lenin. When Lenin died in 1924, the Soviet government decided, why not keep him around? So his body was embalmed, displayed in a glass tomb, and carefully maintained ever since. For nearly a century, visitors have filed past his body in Red Square, gazing at the waxy figure that looks more like a department store mannequin than a revolutionary leader. Teams of scientists re-embalm him every year, using secret formulas involving glycerol, potassium acetate, and other chemicals. Basically, Lenin has had the most high-maintenance afterlife in history, and it worked so well that other leaders copied it. Mao Zedong in China, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Kim Il-sung in North Korea, all embalmed and put on display. It's a kind of political relic cult, except instead of saints, it's 20th century dictators. So the afterlife of Lenin isn't rest at all. It's eternal PR duty for the Soviet legacy. Gunther von Hagens and body worlds fast forward to the late 20th century, and corpses got a modern art makeover. In the 1990s, German anatomist Gunther von Hagens developed plastination, a process that replaces body fluids with plastic, preserving corpses in lifelike poses. He then created the Body Worlds exhibition, where real human corpses are displayed doing activities, riding bicycles, playing chess, dancing. Millions of people have seen these exhibitions worldwide. Some find it educational, others find it deeply unsettling. But either way, the afterlife for these individuals is not 6 feet under. It's standing under a spotlight in an art gallery, frozen mid-Gulf swing. And yes, some of the bodies may have come from questionable sources, including unclaimed corpses from prisons. So once again, the dead didn't always have much of a choice. The museum debate by the mid-20th century, museums began facing criticism. Human remains that had once been proudly displayed were suddenly awkward. Was it really appropriate to keep skulls, mummies, and skeletons behind glass for tourists to stare at? Some museums quietly packed their human remains into storage. Others kept them out, but with new labels about cultural sensitivity. And repatriation movements grew louder, especially from indigenous groups whose ancestors had been taken during the colonial period. Today, the debate continues. Some say remains are valuable for education. Others argue they should be returned, buried and left in peace. In a sense, even in the 21st century, the afterlives of these bodies are still unsettled. Why did this fascination continue? If we step back and look at all of this, freak shows, photographs, political embalming, plastinated art exhibits, one thing becomes clear. Human beings never stopped being curious about the dead. Sometimes it's spiritual, Sometimes it's scientific, and sometimes it's just morbid curiosity with a ticket price attached. The dead became entertainment. They became symbols. They became specimens. And all of that means their afterlives were far more complicated than their actual lives ever were. So, as we drift out of the 20th century and into our own time, the story of mummies, relics, and corpses isn't finished. In fact, it's still happening. Bodies are still embalmed, displayed, and debated. The question of who owns the dead, families, nations, museums, or no one at all, continues to haunt us. Digital ghosts, DNA, and the internet afterlife so. The 21st century. You'd think by now we'd have moved past the obsession with corpses. But instead of glass coffins or carnival tents, the fascination has simply shifted onto computer screens. Because apparently, human remains are just too interesting to leave buried. The age of DNA. Let's start with DNA. In the past 30 years, scientists have gotten very good at pulling genetic material out of ancient bones and mummies. And of course, they've been eager to show off. Suddenly, we can tell what a Viking ate for breakfast 1,000 years ago. We can map the plague genome from medieval skeletons. We can even tell if King Tut's parents were awkwardly a little too closely related. Spoiler, yes they were. So corpses that once sat quietly in their tombs are now having their family secrets aired out on the evening news. Imagine resting for 3,000 years, only for some grad student in 2010 to announce your inbreeding to the entire planet. That's the modern afterlife. Facial reconstructions. Meet your ancestors. Then there's the trend of facial reconstruction. Take a skull, scan it, add clay or computer modeling, and voila. A digital face. Museums and documentaries love this. Suddenly, ancient queens and anonymous skeletons become 3D Instagram-ready models. They get named things like Jane Doe of Pompeii or the Staffordshire Girl. And people on the internet debate whether they were hot or not. Yes, we have reached the point where medieval peasants are being rated for attractiveness on Twitter. The afterlife just got a social media profile. Corpses as tourist attractions. Meanwhile, tourism hasn't slowed down. If anything, it's gotten bigger. People flock to see Lenin's body in Moscow. Crowds line up in Beijing for Mao. Pilgrims in Vietnam shuffle past Ho Chi Minh. And in North Korea, visitors whisper reverently before Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. Both embalmed like glossy wax statues. But it's not just dictators. All over the world, mummies are still on display. In Peru, in Egypt, in Italy's Capuchin catacombs, where hundreds of skeletons in decaying robes stare at tourists from the walls. And of course, social media has changed the vibe. Instead of hushed awe, it's selfies with corpses. You'll see someone in Ray-Bans grinning next to a 500-year-old skeleton like it's just another landmark. The dead are now part of the travel. Aesthetic, digital resurrection technology has also given us the strange phenomenon of digital resurrection. Remember, that Egyptian mummy whose vocal tract was 3D printed. So, scientists could replicate what he sounded like. The result? A single awkward ah noise, somewhere between a foghorn and a kazoo. Not exactly profound, but there it is. The voice of the dead piped through a lab speaker. And then there's holograms. Concerts have brought back dead musicians. Historians have floated the idea of holographic reenactments of kings and queens. So one day, don't be surprised if you're walking through a museum and Henry VIII himself waddles out in pixelated glory, demanding turkey legs and another wife. The afterlife is going high-tech, whether the dead like it or not. The true crime industry. Let's drift into another modern phenomenon, true crime. Podcasts, documentaries, YouTube channels. So many of them center on the bodies of the dead, re-examined, dissected, autopsied, rehashed endlessly for entertainment. In a way, modern murder victims are treated like saints of an alternative religion. Their stories are preserved, replayed, and obsessed over. It's not bones in reliquaries anymore. It's autopsy photos in documentaries. And let's not forget the tourists who flock to crime scenes and graves. From Jack the Ripper walking tours in London, to fans leaving lipstick kisses on Jim Morrison's tomb in Paris. The line between mourning, obsession, and entertainment has completely dissolved. Digital, skeletons in the closet, the internet, has also made it easy for corpses to live on in weirder ways. Take Ötzi the Iceman, the 5,000-year-old mummy found in the Alps. He now has a Twitter account. Yes, someone runs an official social media profile for him, posting updates like still frozen after all these years, or King Richard III, dug up from under a parking lot in Leicester in 2012. His bones were turned into memes. The poor guy spent centuries buried anonymously, only to have the internet roast him for scoliosis and bad parking. So, the afterlife isn't just in tombs or museums anymore. It's in hashtags, memes, and viral TikToks. Congratulations, you're content now. The ethics question, of course, all this raises uncomfortable questions. Who owns the dead? Should indigenous remains be returned to their communities? Should mummies be left in peace instead of under fluorescent lights in tourist-packed museums? Should true crime victims' autopsy details really be public entertainment? Museums argue for education. Scientists argue for research. Families argue for dignity. And the internet? The internet just wants content. So the debate goes on. And the dead once again have no say in it. The never-ending afterlife. If there's one thing we can see across history, it's that human remains almost never get to rest quietly. From saints chopped into relics, to mummies sold as medicine, to DNA samples sequenced in labs, corpses keep getting pulled back into the world of the living. Their afterlives are longer, stranger and more public than their actual lives ever were. And in the digital age, that's only accelerating. Once you're a mummy, a saint, or even just an unlucky outlaw like Elmer McCurdy, there's no guarantee you'll stay underground. Because if history has shown us anything, it's that the living just can't resist dragging the dead back out for another performance. The Restless Dead, a soft closing reflection. So here we are. After hours of drifting through tombs, shrines, cabinets of curiosity, and modern museums, we've traced the strange, restless afterlives of human remains. And if there's one theme that keeps floating to the surface, it's this. People almost never get to rest the way they intended. The pharaohs imagined eternal security behind their curses and pyramids. Medieval saints probably didn't expect to be chopped up and mailed across Europe like divine souvenirs. Colonized peoples certainly never asked for their skulls to be measured, catalogued, and shoved into glass cases. And no one, absolutely no one, ever wrote "display me in a carnival tent" into their will. But that's exactly what kept happening. Century after century, we, the living, decided that the dead were too valuable, too interesting, or simply too profitable to leave alone. The uses of the dead. Sometimes they were used for religion. Bodies of saints became spiritual power sources, filling churches with pilgrims and filling church coffers with money. Sometimes they were used for science. Skulls and skeletons became data points in elaborate theories. Some useful, some laughably wrong. Sometimes they were used for politics. From Lenin to Mao, embalmed leaders became symbols of eternal power, frozen in carefully lit tombs as reminders of authority. And sometimes they were used for plain old entertainment. Mummies unwrapped in parlors, carnival corpses toured like circus animals. Even today, skeletons sit under museum spotlights as tourists shuffle past with cameras. So the afterlife, as it turns out, is never just spiritual. It's practical. It's profitable. And often it's deeply undignified. The irony of immortality? Here's the real irony. Most people fear being forgotten, But history suggests that being remembered might actually be worse. If you're remembered, you're rarely remembered as you were. You're remembered as an object, a specimen, a teaching aid, or if you're unlucky, a meme. Take poor King Richard III, buried quietly for centuries only to be dug up from under a parking lot and turned into punchlines about scoliosis. Or Sarah Bartman, whose body became a century-long science exhibit before anyone thought to say, maybe this isn't respectful. The dream of immortality often comes with a grim price tag, endless objectification, the blurred line, and what really makes this story strange is how blurry the line always is, between reverence and exploitation, between veneration and voyeurism, between education and entertainment. A pilgrim in the year 1200, kneeling before a saint's femur in a jeweled reliquary, isn't so different from a tourist in 2024 taking a selfie with Lenin. The settings change, the technology changes, but the impulse is the same. We want the dead to do something for us, to inspire us, teach us, amuse us, or reassure us. It's never enough to just let them be. The dead have no say. Of course, the dead themselves are silent. They can't object. They can't vote on whether they'd prefer eternal burial or eternal display. So we keep deciding for them. And in a way, maybe that's the most human part of all this. We project our needs, our fears, our curiosities onto the remains of others. We use them as mirrors, reflecting whatever we're anxious about in our own lives. For the medieval peasant, relics were proof of heaven. For the 19th century scientist, skulls were proof of racial theories. For the 20th century tourist, mummies were proof of adventure and discovery. And for us, scrolling online today, corpses are just another kind of content. The dead become whatever the living need them to be, a gentle ending. So as we wrap this long drift through the history of restless corpses, what's left? Maybe just this. We've always lived side by side with the dead, whether we acknowledge it or not. They fill our museums, our churches, our textbooks, and even our Netflix queues. They've never really left us. And maybe they never will. It's unsettling. It's unsettling, it's a little absurd, and it's also oddly comforting. Because in the end, the dead are never truly gone. They're part of our stories, whether they like it or not. So tonight, as you lie back, eyes heavy, drifting off, picture all those restless bones and waxy corpses tucked back into their tombs and glass cases. Quiet now, silent again, at least for a few hours. And maybe, just maybe, they'll let you rest easier than history ever let them. That's the end of our sleepy journey through the strange afterlives of mummies and relics. Epilogue, the quiet company of the dead, so here we are. We've wandered through deserts and catacombs, past saints' shrines and carnival tents, and even into the bright LED-lit museums of today. We've looked at mummies who wanted eternity, saints who didn't ask to be chopped into souvenirs, outlaws who became ticketed attractions, and dictators who just won't leave the stage. And now there's nowhere else to go, except back into the quiet, the stillness where the dead actually belong. Why we keep digging. The question that keeps humming in the background is, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep digging them up, parading them around, scanning their DNA or lighting them under glass? Maybe it's fear. The fear that if we let them go, we'll forget ourselves too. That if their names vanish, ours will vanish as well. Or maybe it's vanity. Because every time we put a mummy on display, every time we embalm a leader to look eternal, we're really whispering, look how powerful we are. Even over death, or maybe it's just curiosity. Because if you hand a human being a locked box, they will open it. Even if it's a coffin, especially if it's a coffin. Strange immortality. The dead, in all their strange afterlives, have achieved a kind of immortality. Not the one they planned, not the one the priests promised, but immortality all the same. King Tut didn't get his golden eternity with the gods. Instead, he got a gift shop in Cairo, St. Catherine didn't exactly get to rest whole. Instead, she scattered across churches like a puzzle box. Elmer McCurdy never got peace in a graveyard. Instead, he became a carnival prop for half a century. It's not the immortality anyone asked for, but it's immortality nonetheless. In the end, the dead outlast us in ways they never imagined. The dead as companions, and maybe that's why we never leave them alone. The dead aren't just relics of the past, they're companions. Quiet companions that we drag along through our own lives, reshaping them to fit whatever stories we need. When we're religious, we turn them into saints. When we're scientific, we turn them into specimens. When we're political, we turn them into symbols. When we're bored, we turn them into content. The dead are always with us, not just in cemeteries, but in our politics, our museums, our Netflix documentaries, our memes, the gentle absurdity. And if you zoom out just a little, it all starts to feel absurd. Bones in reliquaries, heads in cabinets, outlaws mistaken for wax figures, dictators who still need annual maintenance like overripe wax fruit. It's all a bit ridiculous, but maybe that's the perfect note to end on. Because history is always a mixture of tragedy and comedy, solemnity and silliness, and the afterlives of mummies and relics capture that better than almost anything else. A whispered farewell, so as you lie back now, heavy-eyed, maybe think of all those restless figures tucked away again, the pharaohs sliding back into their pyramids, the saints piecing themselves back together. Elmer McCurdy finally settling into Oklahoma dirt. Lenin dimming under the lights as the museum doors close. They're still there. Always there. But for tonight they can rest. And so can you. Because for all our centuries of poking, prodding, embalming, dissecting, photographing and meme-making, the dead still manage to fall silent once the lights go out. And maybe that's the only real afterlife they ever needed. And that's it. The last word, the last murmur, the final drift. The strange afterlives of mummies and relics is done. The corpses are quiet again. Time for you to be too. The long fade into silence, so we're still here. Still talking about the dead. Still floating in that hazy middle ground between history and sleep. And maybe that's fitting, because the afterlife of relics isn't really about answers. It's about echoes. And echoes don't stop just because the main story's over. The dead outliving the living. When you really think about it, the strangest thing about all these mummies, relics, and embalmed leaders is how long they outlived the people who looked at them. Every tourist who shuffled past King Tut in the 1920s, gone. Every soldier who prayed to a saint's bone before a battle, gone. Every carnival goer who saw Elmer McCurdy hanging in wax museums, gone, but Tut's still in his case. Catherine's bones are still scattered in reliquaries. Elmer's still in Oklahoma dirt. Lenin is still propped up in Moscow. The spectators vanish. The exhibits remain. It's almost comic. Like the dead are the only ones who manage to keep their booking long-term. The silence they hold. The truth is, most of history is noise. Battles, speeches, scandals, court gossip, angry letters, petty rivalries, royal meltdowns. It's all so loud. And then there are the dead. They don't talk back. They don't argue. They just lie there, mute reminders of everything that used to matter but doesn't anymore. That silence is oddly comforting. You can project anything onto it. A mummy in a case can be a sacred ancestor, a tragic victim, a scientific specimen, or just a quiet roommate for a drowsy museum guard. The dead don't complain. They let us do the talking. Our endless rearrangements over and over, we rearrange them. Move them from tombs to museums. Shift them from shrines to reliquaries. Repackage them from carnival props to crime exhibits. Rebrand them from saints to cultural heritage. Every generation thinks it's doing something new, something respectful, something final. But it never is. For it's just another version of the same story. The living can't resist touching the dead, and the dead, predictably, never resist back. Rest versus display. It makes you wonder. What's better? To be left in the dirt undisturbed, or to be endlessly displayed, endlessly handled, endlessly reinterpreted? We assume rest is better, but is it? Maybe immortality, even the weird, waxy, glass-cased kind, is its own kind of reward. Maybe Tut would have preferred obscurity. But would we? Would we prefer a world where he was never rediscovered? Where the treasures stayed locked away? Probably not. We want them on display because their immortality makes our lives feel a little less temporary. The final drift, and so here we are, circling back, like a needle stuck in a groove. The same themes: immortality, absurdity, silence, display. There's nothing new left to add, just the comfort of repetition. The steady hum of the same thought turning over and over, softer each time, until it blurs into nothing, like the relics themselves, repackaged again and again, but always the same bones underneath. Good night to the dead, so let's say good night one last time. Good night to the pharaohs under gold. Good night to the saints in their reliquaries. Good night to the waxy strongmen in their glass boxes. Good night to the carnival corpses and the traveling heads. Good night to the dead, who will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the century after, while we, the noisy, restless living, will be gone. And maybe that's the real lesson. The dead don't need us, but we always need them, so let them rest. Let yourself rest, because the story's over, and silence is all that's left. The long good night of history, so we're still here, and you're still here, which means neither of us is quite asleep yet, and that's fine. History is patient. The dead are patient. They've waited centuries. They can wait a little longer while you drift. Circling the same thought, you might have noticed how I keep circling back. To Tut, to Saint's bones, to Lenin in his glass box, to Elmer in the carnival. It's not laziness. It's just that history itself circles. The same stories keep reappearing, dressed in new costumes. One era embalms a king in oils and resins. Another era embalms a revolutionary in chemicals. One era prays to a saint's rib bone. Another era studies DNA from a mummy's femur. Different centuries. Same impulse. We can't let go. The human itch, it's almost an itch. A deep human itch that says, touch the past again. Don't just leave it alone. Handle it, test it, break it open, rewrap it, display it, Instagram it. Because the past left untouched is terrifying. It reminds us that everything ends. So we poke at it, like kids poking a campfire long after the flames are gone. And what do we get for our trouble? A puff of smoke, a flicker of warmth. Just enough to convince ourselves it's still alive. The strange comfort of bones, relics, mummies. They don't mean anything by themselves. They're just leftovers. Calcium, collagen, dried tissue. But the moment we attach stories, they come alive. Tut isn't just a boy buried too young. He's the golden pharaoh, the blockbuster exhibition, the symbol of Egypt itself. A saint's femur isn't just bone. It's a charm, a cure, a holy presence. Elmer McCurdy wasn't just a dead outlaw. He was a sideshow, a punchline, a weird little slice of Americana. The bones don't change. We do, we project. And in projecting, we keep them alive. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the dead don't get a choice about their afterlives. Maybe immortality isn't earned or chosen or deserved. Maybe it's assigned by us, by whoever comes later. You don't get to decide if you'll be remembered. You don't get to decide if your body ends up in peace or in a reliquary or in a museum case or on a Netflix special. History decides. Strangers decide, and they usually decide in the weirdest ways possible. The quiet joke. And that's the quiet joke running under everything. The most powerful kings, the holiest saints, the wildest criminals, they all end up the same. Silent. At the mercy of other people's curiosity. Maybe 1,000 years from now, some future historian will be narrating about us, about how we embalmed our leaders, or dissected our celebrities' DNA, or left behind digital relics in the cloud, and maybe they'll laugh softly. The same way we're laughing at carnival corpses and scattered saint bones, because what seems solemn now always ends up silly later, the long good night. So let's stretch out the good night a little longer. Good night to the pharaohs in their golden beds. Good night to the saints split up like jigsaw puzzles. Good night to the waxy leaders under glass. Good night to the outlaws mistaken for mannequins. Good night to all the relics we've fussed over, catalogued, rebranded, and sold tickets to see. And good night to us too, because one day we'll be relics in our own right. And someone somewhere will tell our story with the same calm irony, fading to nothing. The truth is there's nothing left to add. We've said it all and then said it again and then again after that. And now the words are just looping sounds, like waves on a beach, repeating the same soft rhythm, not meant to inform anymore, just meant to lull, to carry you across that thin line into sleep, because the dead are already asleep, and it's time you joined them. And that's the real end. No more relics, no more mummies, no more afterlives, just silence, the long good night of history. And maybe that's the strangest part. The story never really ends. We wrap it up, we close the book, we say good night, but the echoes keep going, like footsteps in an empty hallway, like a candle still glowing after the room is dark. The mummies are still in their cases. The relics are still in their shrines. The waxy dictators are still under glass. Nothing has changed, except that our voices have gone quiet. And even then, someone else will come along and start telling the same story again. Repetition as memory, that's what memory is. After all, repetition. Repetition until it sticks. Repetition until it feels eternal. That's why Tut is still Tut. That's why saints still have feast days. That's why Lenin still lies in his mausoleum. Because people kept repeating the names, repeating the stories, repeating the rituals. Without repetition, everything fades. With repetition, even a fragment of bone can outlast empires. A universe of relics. If you zoom out far enough, you start to see it differently. Everywhere the world is full of relics. Every city is a reliquary. Every museum is a mausoleum. Every memory is a mummy, carefully embalmed in words and images so it doesn't dissolve. We are all curators. We are all grave robbers. We are all priests of our own tiny shrines, carrying pieces of the past in our pockets. And one day, those little relics will be all that's left of us, slipping toward quiet. The longer you sit with that thought, the softer it becomes. Not frightening, not tragic, just quiet. Like holding a seashell to your ear and hearing the ocean that isn't there. Like staring at an old photograph until the faces blur into shapes. Like listening to a voice that's still speaking, even when you've stopped paying attention. It's background. It's hum. It's the sound of time itself, the final murmur. And so one more time, good night. Good night to the Golden Kings. Good night to the saints in boxes. Good night to the criminals turned exhibits. Good night to the waxworks of politics. Good night to the endless echoes of the past. And good night to you. Because the only relic that matters right now is your body finding rest. Let the noise fade. Let the words dissolve. Let the silence carry you off. Because history is still here. The relics are still here. And they'll still be waiting when you wake.